I felt so original. Oh, I'm reading the classic. And then I realized, a lot of people do that. And the more bookish you are, the more likely you are to do it. So I thought about what that meant. And I thought, well, I could name at least 5 books right now where people read classic books as a way of coping with grief. And I think they do it because it's a fixed, orderly thing. You start at one place, you go to another place, a certain amount of variation, but not a lot. And it puts you in touch with this wider perspective, a long historical perspective, and in which you realize, or at least I realized, that the classics are not about happy events. They're not bright and shining, as some critics think. They're actually about family trauma over and over and over again, and grief and death and war and the terrible things that happen to people and the unforgivable things that people do. And I thought, oh, well, it's interesting that the classics are talked about as sources of wisdom, but they're actually sources of anxiety relief. I mean, I'm not so bad. Look at these people.
Marianna, thank you so much for joining us here on the Science of Psychotherapy podcast. It's so great to meet you.
Nice to meet you too. Thank you for having me.
And Richard here, so I'm here as well, and very excited because we have the good fortune to be introduced through various people to wonderful people like yourself, and I was immediately attracted to the story of the books, which is one of the reasons, and your very interesting work at Crossing Ocean Parkway was a book that was previously done, and you've done a follow-up, Crossing
right.
Back. Now, rather than me describe it, let's use that as a segue, because I know there's a lot more going on in what you want to talk about and what you're able to talk about it. But what's sort of the stories and what brought you into this level of public awareness?
Crossing Ocean Parkway was born out of the experience of coming from an Italian-American background. I am pure-blooded Sicilian Calabrian, so Southern Italian,
Yeah.
And growing up in Brooklyn, 1950s, 1960s, and finding that a difficult place to be as an ambitious woman who wanted to go to college and all that good stuff. Italian-Americans have made an enormous amount of change in the group in the last 30 years. But when I was growing up, women didn't go to college. They got married. And if they did go to college, they became elementary school teachers. And I had other ambitions. And my parents, who were lovely people, but somewhat conservative and limited by their own backgrounds, were just not sure how to deal with that. So I wrote this book when I was a full professor at Duke University and had taught at Williams College, 2 very elite schools, populated by very wealthy people. At Williams, almost entirely white. Duke, less so, but still largely white. Very upper crust, mostly Protestant. And I had been raised Catholic. I was extremely working class, and so my medium of exit from my social class was marrying a Jewish man from the other side of Ocean Parkway, where a college education was extremely valued, and feminine independence was extremely valued, and everyone in his family immediately understood that. And so I actually got married when I was in college, graduated as Mrs. Torgovnick, and kept the name. My unmarried name was DeMarco, and so I use it when I'm writing autobiographically. So Crossing Ocean Parkway was about Italian Americans in New York, Jewish Americans in New York, and the experience of the death of my first child when I was teaching at Williams College, and then a series of essays about Italian-American intellectuals, Camille Paglia, Mario Puzo. There's an essay on the politics of the we. And my father happened to die as I was finishing that book. And so the last essay was about the death of my father. Fast forward a number of years. It's a little scary to think how many, but a lot of years. My mother is still alive. My mother, after my father's death, partners with the man downstairs who falls in love with her good looks and her cooking. My brother is furious at my mother's finding another man. My mother, at age 90, contracts her first and only illness, which turned out to be colon cancer, has surgery, has a stroke, and dies. My brother died shortly after pancreatic cancer, upending our expectation of longevity in the family because there had been a lot of long life in my family. And I found myself in a little bit of a tailspin. I'm somebody who normally writes a book every 5 years, and I kept starting Crossing Back and writing it and putting it away, starting it again, putting it away, starting it again, putting it away. And I just finally said, oh, this has to stop. I really need to finish this. And so I just looked at it and I realized there were some chapters I just simply couldn't make work. So I took them out and looked at what I had left and gave it some form. And now it's a memoir about the process of grief, the grief at my mother's death, the grief at my brother's death, the complicating factor of my first child's death, which I had never fully acknowledged, and the various methods that I used to kind of move from that state of grief toward a feeling of more normalcy in my life. I mean, was I mad crazy? No, but I was moving apartments all the time. I was fighting with my husband. I was restless like crazy, and I couldn't figure out what was going on.
Yeah,
so
yeah, I know it's fantastic, Marianna. They're an extraordinary, when we look back on our own life, and we sort of go, oh wow, there's a lot of things that happened. And I'm just thinking as I listen to you there, these extraordinarily poignant aspects of grief: loss of mother, loss of brother, loss of child. But crossing Ocean Parkway, I can sense the possibility of there being some degree of loss and change and shift that might have involved that sort of broad, more generalistic aspect of grief, of having to find the way to change there. Do they cross over or poly in? What's the frame there?
I wouldn't say that grief was my primary emotion in Crossing Ocean Parkway. I mean, I was in my mid-30s. I had two young daughters. I was an administrator in my academic department. I had published what for an academic was a best-selling book called Gone Primitive. So I was experimenting with memoir and the personal voice in writing, which was a great thing because academics are trained to write in very dull ways that push people away. And I was experimenting in ways that were warm and personal and pulling people in. So it wasn't a grief reaction. I mean, decades later, you're older, you're aware that that when your birth family dies, which is what this book is about, you're it. You are the repository of memory. There were many things I would have liked to know, but relatives had either disappeared or had died, and there was no way of finding them out. So, I never knew how my father would feel about the essay about his dying. I'm pretty sure my brother would hate this book. I don't know how my mother would feel, but I was pretty sure that, well, obviously they're dead, so they would never know. But even had they been alive, I'm pretty sure they wouldn't have read it, so they wouldn't have known that I had done it.
So what I'm fascinated about is the fact that as an author, you dive into these topics and something so personal, something that often many people will try to avoid at all costs, and you go headlong into it by writing, essays about very personal loss. So I'm wondering, what did you discover through that process? Let me talk to the author in you. What did you discover as you put these things down in writing?
Well, at first, with Crossing Back, I didn't know what I was writing about. When my mother died, I was writing a book which in my mind was called The Classic and the Contemporary, and was about the relationship of the classics, the Greek and Roman classics and Renaissance classics, to contemporary literature and contemporary life. Well, that quickly kind of went away. I had just finished a book called The War Complex, which is about how World War II is remembered in our time. And I was having an enormous amount of trouble accepting, this may sound strange, I was having an enormous amount of trouble accepting the fact that I was in grief. because I had just been writing about World War II. Hey, a lot of people experienced grief in World War II. Families were disrupted. Life was disrupted for many, many years. There's an essay about the Holocaust in there, but the aerial bombings of Germany and Japan, so much loss, the massive loss of life in the Soviet Union. So much loss. And my mother was 91. And why was I having such grief? So I was having trouble writing it. So then I thought I was writing a book about the classics and war. Well, that worked better. There's a lot of war in classics. So that was kind of working, but it wasn't going anywhere. And then I noticed as I was doing this, and by the way, did I tell you my mother died? And I was talking about my mother's sister. And then when my brother died about a year later, did I mention my brother died? So I quickly realized that what I was really doing was writing a memoir. But then the problem was how to integrate all these different strands that I had going. I finally, at one point I tried unifying it by recipes, and that turned into a chapter in the book about food and families and cooking as a method of recovering family connections. And then I was doing meditation after my mother died. I had been a physical yogi before. At one point during this whole process, the stuff I tried was actually kind of nuts. I have these short arms and short legs, and I decided, I'm going to learn to teach yoga, as though I didn't have enough to do in life. So I thought, let me try and learn to do yoga. And then I realized, oh man, that's not going to work. But I did start meditating for 20 minutes a day. And that was really helpful. That put me in a different space. So I guess the answer to the question, it's not very satisfying, but I didn't sort of confront the writing about grief directly. I confronted it by indirection. Roland Barthes, a famous critic, published a book called A Mourner's Diary during this period. And he talks about he was so deeply in grief, he got hit by a car and died. He just wasn't able to concentrate on life at all. Very famous man. And he had a phrase which stuck in my mind, at least in translation. The phrase was memory without pain, that the goal of the mourning process is memory without pain. So I kind of was beginning to kind of, is that fully possible? To what extent is it possible? So I was examining that. So I guess, I'm a literary critic. So I was examining a lot of what I was doing. Why was I reading classic books? Why do people do that? Why was I meditating? Why do people do that? Why do people cook? I was kind of self-analyzing because that's the kind of person I am.
Yeah.
I'm an academic. I kind of look at what I'm doing rather than just do it.
Interesting. Yes, for better or for worse. Yeah. Interestingly, I actually think you answered the question really well.
Yes.
And I loved that. But I love that point of I wasn't necessarily, specifically directly journaling for the process of, but through the process of writing and expressing, and I guess putting it out there, putting things outside of the private space.
There are really beautiful grief memoirs. There's a guy named Goldman did a book called Say Her Name about the death of his fiancée in a kind of freak accident in the ocean. Beautiful book. Joan Didion, who's a little too mannered for me, the Year of Magical Thinking, and the follow-up on her daughter's death, Blue Nights, I think it's called, a little too mannered for me. Joyce Carol Oates, a writer I love and a friend, but she did a book called The Widow Story, which I thought was a little too close to the experience. So there people do grief memoirs, but I kind of wasn't setting out to do that. I wanted to do something which had a wider valence, a wider focus.
Yeah. I lost a close young family member to suicide, and it was interesting. I wrote a book that helped me work through the grief, and her brother wrote a book that helped him work through the grief. And just listening to what you're saying there, his book was beautiful, but it was just heart-wrenching. And my book was a whole set of positive parables, really. I just went on a world trip and I wrote about everything positive that I could see in the world. So that's very, very different experience. But what's lovely in amongst all this, you've alluded to it, but I'd like to, if we could just go a little bit more into these ways of managing, these ways of going through the cooking chapter, the meditation, the yoga. How are these things productive and helpful, and what are some of the ways you talk about their benefits?
Yeah. Well, one of the things I realized is that all of the things I was doing had some common traits. The first thing I started doing was reading the classic books, and I did it in a very systematic way. Homer, Aeschylus, Euripides. I was very methodical. I just came forward, and I lingered at Dante because I had taught Dante, and Dante was especially meaningful to me. That's one of those chapters that never made it into the book. I just couldn't get it right. And then I realized I felt so original. Oh, I'm reading the classic. And then I realized, a lot of people do that. And the more bookish you are, the more likely you are to do it. So I thought about what that meant. And I thought, well, I could name at least 5 books right now where people read classic books as a way of coping with grief. And I think they do it because it's a fixed, orderly thing. You start at one place, you go to another place, a certain amount of variation, but not a lot. And it puts you in touch with this wider perspective, a long historical perspective, and in which you realize, or at least I realized, that the classics are not about happy events. They're not bright and shining, as some critics think. They're actually about family trauma over and over and over again, and grief and death and war and the terrible things that happen to people and the unforgivable things that people do. And I thought, oh, well, it's interesting that the classics are talked about as sources of wisdom, but they're actually sources of anxiety relief. I mean, I'm not so bad. Look at these people. Okay, so there was that. Meditation is very similar. It's like chanting or prayer. There's a series of events of things you'd follow before you go into it. All forms of meditation, and maybe especially the one I was following, it has a lineage. So there's a long past behind it. You go through the sequence, and again, you're in the state of mind of meditation. So you're thinking. Well, you're not thinking, you are yourself. You can't help but be yourself, but you stop thinking and your mind goes to a place which becomes aware, oh, there are spaces that aren't me, and there are things that are bigger than me. And it just helps to put things in perspective. So again, regularity, order, lineage, perspective. Cooking is a little different. I think cooking depends on the role of cooking in your household and the role of cooking in your ethnic group. I'm Italian American. My mother was a dynamite cook. She never wrote anything down. I figured out after my father died that she actually had never learned to read and write, because she had grown up she was American born, but went to Calabria and then came back to America. And she just was never in the educational system. So very smart woman, but she never learned to read and write. So she never wrote a recipe down. So I did write some of her recipes down while she was alive, but what I didn't write down was lost. And there was one particular recipe which I knew I had written down, but as I was moving from place to place, I had lost, for an Italian pastry called Sfingi. And it was like, oh my gosh, I was cooking her recipes. I was duplicating them. I gave copies to both of my daughters of this book that I put together, Where are the Sfingi? So it was a source of great loss. And then my younger daughter found it. And so now we had the Sfingi. So I was able to cook it and we were able to recreate that. No. So I'm not sure is there method there? There's method, there's lineage, but it's much shorter. It's more personal, I think, than either of the other two. Yeah.
Okay, so what I'm wanting to find out from because you've read a lot of literature on this topic. So are there common factors that because there seems to be, like, everyone's an individual and everyone has an individual approach to, processing, loss and trauma. But can we identify from the classics and from your own personal experience some commonalities and common factors? Because I think if we can identify some common factors, we can also then identify some anchors. I mean, you talked about regularity, order, this food, these for me, these sound like anchors that can ground you as you're processing the grief.
Yeah. I think that's true. I guess I'll start with a classic reference in Homer's The Odyssey. Odysseus's son is told by the goddess Athena, it's a wise child who knows his own father. And in crossing back, I changed the genders. It's a wise child who knows her own mother. But I think that one of the common elements in any book about grief is going to be a relationship with parents and what it taught you about being a warm-hearted person or a reserved, cold-hearted person. And that affects the way that you're going to encounter the situation. Now, I grew up it was a loving home, but the ways that loving were expressed were extremely indirect. I mean, it was, have a meatball. Let me buy you a dress. Let me keep the floor clean. There was a loving household. There was absolutely nothing unloving about it, but it was very controlled and reserved. My husband comes from a family which is like, oh, you're the most beautiful, you're the most wonderful, you're the most amazing. It's warm-hearted, and it's also chaotic, but it's very warm-hearted. So I think that people need to come to terms with that, the basic template that they're starting with. The next thing they have to come together with is their own particular temperament, which again can be analytical, or, geez, I'm a mess, or I can barely hold it together here. You probably don't get to write a book if you're in that condition, but some people come very close. So coming to terms with your own temperament. Is there anything? Oh, I think whatever role religion plays in your life is going to impact the way that you process grief. Again, I don't know how personal. Well, why not? I mean, you're asking. I mean, I grew up as a Catholic, and there is a residue of Catholicism in me, but the Catholic Church services for the dead were totally unsatisfactory to me. They were very impersonal. The priest announced that we were to have faith in the afterlife and be comforted. That's it. And there was no, not even any personal reference to the person who had died. And again, my husband's tradition, the Jewish tradition, is very different. There's a lot of talking about the person. A dear friend just died of pancreatic cancer, as my brother did, and at his service, and it was an Anglican service, there was a lot of talking about him. So it's that there is that. So I mean, I'm sure his family found that a comforting ritual. I did not find the Catholic rituals comforting. So again, the role of religion and the role of the rituals that are part of your tradition, I think, need to be part of any writing about grief.
Do you think there's so when faced with mortality, there is commonly a searching for, the transcendent, something beyond?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. My brother, who was always religiously a skeptic, when he was dying of pancreatic cancer, just kept telling me about, Monsignor Robert. Oh, hey, Monsignor Robert. Well, tell me about that. But he suddenly became a devout Catholic. And, it was surprising to me, because it was something that was not part of his makeup. My mother, we never talked about religion. My mother went to church, but I don't know if she was religious. My father, went to church when my mother went to church, but he was not religious. So, I think sure, certainly when you're confronting mortality, the fact of an afterlife is going to be one of the things that you're thinking about. Tomorrow, in fact, I'm teaching Emily Dickinson, because I could not stop for death. In that same class, I'm going to teach Dylan Thomas's "Do Not Go Gentle into That Good Night."
Right. Yes.
And again, by temperament, I mean, Emily Dickinson was someone who deeply resonated with death. I mean, she personifies death. She imagines death as a friend and companion. That television show that they did personifies death and makes death into a character. That's not wrong. She seems to actually have had that kind of relationship to death. I'm going to compare that to a line from Keats that we had come upon 2 or 3 weeks ago, which the students will nod sagely when I remind them of it, where Keats in To a Nightingale talks about, for many a time I have been half in love with easeful death. And that word easeful death is a very significant word. And then Dylan Thomas, of course, rage against the coming of the night. It's a very different kind of temperament entirely.
Yeah. So isn't that interesting? So death, personified as a friend or as a foe, and sometimes both trying to hold both together at the same time.
Many people have experienced the loss of family or friends through cancer, and one of the things when it's, and Susan Sontag talks about this when it's talked about in terms of the fight, the battle. It's just it strikes me as odd and inappropriate. It's not something that one chooses. People handle it in different ways. I felt my brother made all the wrong choices and ended up not being able to get out of a hospital the last 3 months of his life. My friend who just died did get out of a hospital, but was determined to fight it till the end. So there just is, and there's an author, Siddhartha Mukherjee, who did a book called The Emperor of All Maladies about cancer, and he talks about cancer is part of our DNA. Cancer is more efficient than most of our cells, but it's part of us. So the idea of battling, fighting, it's a very common configuration, and I understand it because people do try very hard and give up a lot. And do I understand it? Yeah, I do. But there's something about the metaphor which is a little too reflexive and unthinking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just want to bring in another layer here. Just you mentioned Susan Sontag. It reminds me of something you said earlier of the shift in the status and the nature of, I think, in the social, the economic, the political place of women. So through all this over these decades, you've also had that going on in your experience. And of course, there was a very quick one, a rapid change as you crossed over the parkway. How did that affect things?
For me, it was very quick because I went from Bensonhurst in Brooklyn. By the time I was interviewed at Williams, I was living in Brooklyn Heights, which is the tonier kind of brownstone neighborhood in North Brooklyn. But when I was going to be interviewed at Williams College, I didn't know where it was. So when the bus passed through Amherst, they said, "Wait a minute, aren't we going to William and Mary?" And no, they said, "No, Williams College in Williamstown, Massachusetts." And I later discovered that was astonishingly ignorant of me. But I was in graduate school, but that wasn't my world, so I wasn't paying attention to it. By the time I taught at Duke, which was 5 or 6 years later, this Duke is a university. Doesn't have a lot of students. It has about 8,000 undergraduates, but has a lot of other codicil schools. But at that point, there were like 25 faculty members who were female. And we used to have a women's group to offer support and talk about it. And then after about 5 years into the group, we kind of realized that the people we were trying to advocate with were mostly sitting in the room now. I mean, some of us were deans, some of us were chairs and whatnot. So that began to go away. I don't know what percentage of the faculty now is female, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was 40%. It probably should be closer to 50 or 55%, but 40% is an enormous change. And that's true. It's true in a lot of fields. I don't know what it's like in Australia where you are, but in the United States, it's true. But there's still, it's still a problem. I mean, America has yet to elect a female president. We thought that was going to happen in 2016. It didn't. I think it did, but that's another story. That's another story. So America still has not elected a female president. Germany has had female leaders. Britain has had female leaders, has one now. India has had female leaders, countries in South America, but not the United States. I was just watching a pretty wonderful fictionalized documentary about, I'm going to forget her last name, the woman who founded that company for testing the blood. She raised enormous amounts of money, $10 million, $20 million, and had all kinds of prestigious people on her board. And the machine that she had supposedly invented didn't work. And she was
I remember.
Fascinating story. The documentary is called The Dropout by Michael Showalter, who's the son of somebody I know, and I've met Michael. But just a wonderful show, and this kind of mania that was visible in this woman, and you know, I mean, the word on the street was, well, now she's hurt women entrepreneurs who want to do startups, and that happens. You know, women sometimes wind up catching the rap for things in our culture. You know, some politicians who will not be named can do all kinds of stuff and it just rolls right off them. But, you know, a woman who, for instance, has a separate email account, man, that's bad. You know?
Yeah. We still. I mean, I think Australia still suffers this. We're doing pretty well. We have in the current more progressive party, we have quite a lot of women and very, very influential and very well respected and utilized women, which is fantastic. Our foreign minister at the moment is probably one of the safest intelligences in our whole government. So I'm so glad she's our foreign minister right now.
Yeah. I mean, the same is true here. I mean, Nancy Pelosi, you know, I mean, the woman is 80 years old and just a phenomenon to be going to the extent that she is. And there is a very strong, I mean, Liz Cheney was incredible. What she's done this last year, just incredible. I'm expecting we'll see her again in some national role. But I don't know. There's still like a bracket. You know, a woman who's doing this is still something which is noticed rather than being just totally taken for granted. I mean, women are the majority in colleges right now, and this shouldn't be surprising if they're the majority in the faculty.
But there was a very interesting comment from an African-American elder in relation to Barack Obama when someone said to him, isn't it remarkable that Obama is president? And he said, no, it will be remarkable when it's no longer remarkable.
Yeah.
And this, I think women are perhaps still moving closer towards there, but it's, but thank you so much for just expounding on that other layer, which is so interesting. That's wonderful.
Fantastic. Now, as we kind of wrap it up, I'm wondering if we can sort of go back to the beginning and just revisit, you know, this topic of death, loss, and grief. Are there some sort of takeaways that we can glean from you with all of your knowledge in this area? Yeah.
Well, I think that everyone needs to find their own way. For me, a regular routine of physical yoga followed by meditation was absolutely key because of the kinds of perspective that it gives. Just it slows your breath down, slows your pulse down, just makes you feel calmer. Makes your default reaction kind of laughing rather than scowling, which is helpful in and of itself. So for me, that was enormously important. And then there's one chapter in the book, and it's an exercise which I guess I would recommend for almost anyone who feels like they've acknowledged grief. First thing you have to do is acknowledge grief. You can't deny it. Stay with it for a while. Work it through in whatever way works for you, reading books, chanting, doing, consulting religion, spending time with your psychotherapist, whatever it might be. But then when you feel like you're coming out of it, I did an exercise in memory where I kind of said, well, what is the memory I have first of my father? And then I wrote it down and wrote it up. And what was the memory I had first of my mother? And I wrote it up, my brother. My dead baby didn't have one, but I had one on his behalf. And then I realized that was memory without pain, that I was able to write that and then connect it with the meditation experience. And for me, that was a kind of wrap up and was very important. So I don't think there's one path, but I think it would share the common elements that we've talked about earlier. Awareness of your family heritage, awareness of your temperament, trying out some methods that have worked for other people, seeing if they work for you. And then just being aware when you're coming out of it, let yourself come out of it. Don't get stuck in it. Lots of people, I have one she's not a dear friend, but she's a friend, and she's the widow of a fairly famous writer. And she's become a professional. This is not the person I mentioned earlier. She's become a professional widow. I mean, she's given up her life and trying to recreate things that her husband once wrote. And there's something wrong with that. That's not so much a tribute to the person. It's kind of an unhealthy obsession, I would say. Yeah.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much. There's so much there. And for those, sort of neuroscientific therapists out there, and also your trauma-based, I could hear you hopefully all going, vagal tone, yes, positive affirmation, yes, mental orientation. There's so many things.
I'm sure that's all true.
Yeah. And I just say that because I want our listeners who are starting to think that, go and start looking at these things that we're talking about in various aspects of physical behavior, and go get your book and start relating and engaging and integrating the knowledge, and which is what the science of psychotherapy is all about, is taking whatever is out there and finding its integration. Nothing sits isolated. If it sits isolated, it's possibly wrong. So we just want to thank you so much for sharing an amazing journey. I don't know about you, Matt, but I'm sure. Oh, great. I mean, we went to places. We were in Homer, for goodness sake. What a joy. What a joy. And Dante as well. So thank you so much for taking us on this journey.
Now, Marianna, where can people find out more about you? Do you?
There's a website. The last name is Torgovnick. So MariannaTorgovnick.com. And then you can find the book on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Goodreads, all of the usual suspects.
Fantastic. We'll put those links in the show notes for everybody. Marianna, thank you so much for being here on the Science of Psychotherapy podcast.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye for now.